Hey y'all, back again with John G. Paton, a missionary to the New Hebrides, an autobiography. Chapter 3 is called Consecrated Parents. And so remember, this is John G. Paton, Scottish missionary, reflecting back on his upbringing with his mom and his dad, James and Janet Paton, and all that meant to him. And I pray this is an encouragement to you as you consider this mom and this dad and their influence in their children's lives. In this chapter, he's remembering as we talked about last time, he's remembering the way his home was just filled up, saturated with the Word of God and prayer. He's remembering his family's devotion to the church. Their church was their church meeting place was like 4 miles away, and they would be walking there, and just the devotion that was there. We talked about that last time. Well, right after speaking about that, John begins to describe they're going with their dad to the church meeting in Dumfries. Like I said, that's 4 miles away, and of course they're walking. So let me read this part to you. Each of us, from very early days, considered it no penalty, but a great joy to go with our father to the church. The 4 miles were a treat to our young spirits. The company, by the way, was a fresh incitement, and occasionally some of the wonders of city life rewarded our eager eyes. A few other pious men and women of the best evangelical type went from the same parish to one or other favorite minister at Dumfries. And when these God-fearing peasants foregathered in the way to or from the house of God, we youngsters had sometimes rare glimpses of what Christian talk may be and ought to be. So, a few things that I think are an encouragement to take away from this. It says here that it was no penalty for them to travel that 4 miles to the church with their dad. And in fact, it says it was a great joy. They loved it. They enjoyed it. He goes on in this chapter to talk about some people that seem to experience a religious home, but it was a religious home that didn't seem to be rooted in love and in joy, but rather it was just religion for religion's sake, and the negative effect that seemed to have on some. But listen to the way he talks about the Lord's Day. He says, there were 11 of us brought up in a home like that. And never one of the 11, boy or girl, man or woman, has been heard or ever will be heard saying that Sabbath was dull and wearisome for us. Or suggesting that we have heard or seen any way more likely than that for making the day of the Lord bright and blessed alike for parents and for children. But God help the homes where these things are done by force and not by love. And I think that the encouragement there for us as parents is, we want our children to see these religious devotions that we do, our family religion, whether it's time in the Word, time in prayer, or devotion to the church. We want them to see these things as a joy, not as something that they have to be forced and prodded into that are a bore, but rather this is the worship of the greatest treasure. This is the worship of that treasure who is Christ, and we want them to see that. Now, that being said, obviously that doesn't mean that will always go perfect, or you should be discouraged when children don't seem to view it as a joy. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't teach them diligence, that sometimes there's things they may not want to do, but they should do because it's right and it's good. All those things should be there. So that's true. But how do we encourage them in such a way that they enjoy these things, they love these things? And I think it's directly connected to our love and our enjoyment. So brothers and sisters, especially fathers and mothers, as you lead your family in being devoted to the Word of God and to prayer and to His church, do it with joy. I think it's really, really important that we obey the greatest commandment, love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. To obey Philippians, rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. It's very important that we do that because that's going to have a direct effect on our kids seeing these things not as a religious bore that they're forced into, but as something that, man, my parents view these things, and specifically Christ, as a great treasure that's to be enjoyed and loved. I'm encouraged by that. And one other thing from what we just read, it says that when they were on that 4-mile journey, that there were other Christians that were friends of John's parents, friends of James Paton, that would kind of join them on that trip as they're on the way to the church meeting. And he talks about those times. He says, when these God-fearing peasants foregathered in the way to or from the house of God, we youngsters had sometimes rare glimpses of what Christian talk may be and ought to be. And I love that. I love that as a remembrance of John remembering seeing his dad speak to these other Christians, and that was just this rare glimpse of how Christians ought to talk and encourage each other and worship Jesus together, even just in their normal conversation. And so I think it's neat to see that, and it's neat to see the effect that had on John years later as he reflected back on this. And so I think, again, an encouragement there is real fellowship with the saints. Not friendships like the world, but real fellowship with the saints and real conversation that's an encouragement to one another, that's worshiping Christ together. And Proverbs says that the companion of fools will be destroyed, but he who walks with wise men will be wise. And so leading our children into that, to not to be a companion of fools, but lead them into relationships of wise men and women who love Christ, adore Christ. That's going to have a great impact on our kids. Parents, I hope you're encouraged.